How do you touch the lives of others? I don't mean in a creepy way, in a no-no way. But when we thought about the moon in episode 8, we discussed how you nurture yourself so you have something to give others. And when discussing the dwarf planet Ceres, I want to talk about how you reach out and heal others with your nurturing abilities. Once we work on ourselves and remember who we are and why we incarnated here, we can be of service to others. But how do we get there? As I've mentioned on this show before, I remember talking to a few psychics who I credit with poking my spirituality alive. They all said I was not doing what I was meant to do, that I needed to transform my spiritual practices and transform into my spiritual manifestation, or I was going to keep coming back here and keep incarnating in this same routine. One psychic said, "I don't think you know who you are." And then she kind of corrected herself and she said, "You forgot who you are." You see, I believe we all come here knowing who we are, but we forget. I remember maybe 7 years ago, I used to listen to an herbalist, Tahuti Matra, and he used to say, your astrology chart is like your job application when you come to this realm, when you manifest here. You have a job to do when you get here, but sometimes you just forget what that job is and who you are and how you're supposed to do that job. And depending on where you put your energies, you can be pulled in the direction of not completing your work. And if you don't complete your work here, I'm talking about spiritual work, then the idea is that you just keep coming back. And this comes from the concept of reincarnation, right? From one of the oldest religions, or the oldest, well, it was basically agreed it's the oldest religion, but Dharma, right? Or the Vedic religion. So you just keep coming back. That's the idea. And when thinking of Ceres, we also have to consider the mythology of Proserpina, who gets tricked into eating a pomegranate, the fruit of Hades, and then she must return. And that's why we have the season of winter, supposedly, right? She's also called Demeter. And I can compare this story to us. We live in the spirit realm, and then we kind of get tricked into doing missions down here, and we, come down and we incarnate and we ascend to our spiritual purpose, hopefully, right? We keep coming back over lifetimes. So in that way, we almost are this archetype of Ceres. And we come with a plan. And when the psychics were talking about, oh, you forgot, and when I was saying we forget, what does that mean? Well, I think there's sometimes circumstances that happen to us, and maybe traumatic circumstances, which blind us to our original plan. And until we deal with it and we learn what it is that we're meant to know and to do, or when we remember, we'll stay in the material existence, and we won't be able to reach out to anyone, and we won't even be able to soothe ourselves. A little while ago, I realized that I was approaching life in a way which unconsciously said, I don't know if I'm good enough for you. You could have meant any number of things: people, jobs, opportunities. And I'm going to get criticized if I'm always talking about work, but let's just think about any type of opportunity that you want. It could be monetary based or not, right? But when you say you're not good enough, or you talk yourself out of feeling good enough, it becomes an issue. And I didn't realize that until I started thinking in a different way. Just by shifting some things in my life, I started thinking about situations like, is this good enough for me? And that kind of switched things around. If you're in a situation where you are not being treated well, but you feel like you should stay in this situation. I'm not saying that you can't diffuse situations, that you can't approach situations with kindness, but when you're constantly getting in situations where you're dealing with people who don't value you, who don't respect you have to wonder, why do I keep getting in these situations? Or like, what attracts this to me? And what am I doing that has made this a pattern in my life? You have to start to wonder, and there's going to be a lot of different factors. I'm mainly talking about the spiritual, but there's going to be a lot of different factors that have to do with that. From a spiritual perspective, it really is true that you feel like you're not worthy of love in some way, or you're not dealing with that deep feeling of needing love, and you don't know how to go about getting it. And you don't want to step into your power, because everyone is powerful. They really are. Even if they're in the worst circumstances, people still have that ability to have some type of power, and sometimes the situation can still be bleak. And that's why, again, I come back to spirituality, because it at least gives the suffering in life some meaning. Although I've expressed many times that my view is that we should help people who are suffering, or, not a savior complex, but be there for people and at least, get out of our own way. I think that's essential. So Ceres is associated with the mythological goddess of growing plants and harvest, and also symbolizes your physical constitution, your vitality. And again, she's known as Demeter. And really, you just have to remember that Ceres is like the moon, but has more to do with the actions that you take regarding nurturing. And it's funny because Ceres is also conjunct my moon in my midheaven in the 10th house in Sagittarius. So they're kind of working together there. So you can tell that my emotions are deeply connected with how I interact with people, and that is all connected with my career. And being in Sagittarius, then it has to do with philosophy and knowledge and relating to people and nurturing people that way. That's why I gravitate towards those things. And it's also the most visible point in my natal chart, so if you were looking at the natal chart as a clock, right, because it's a circle, it would be at the noon point, right, the highest point of the chart. That's where the midheaven is. And so, like I mentioned before, technically, Ceres is a dwarf planet, and it is in Neptune's orbit. So remember when we talked about Neptune and lack of boundaries a few episodes back? When we are healing others, we also have a lack of boundaries. Think of the phrase to lay hands on them. If you've never heard that before, in a biblical sense, that meant to heal someone by placing your hands on them. Now, this isn't just in the Bible, right? It's not just the Judeo-Christian tradition. There's lots of different religions around the world that believe in this practice. And today, you may or may not have heard of Reiki, right? Where someone works with your energy and tries to pull out the negative strands of your energy and puts their hands on you. It depends on who's practicing it, but they can put their hands on you, or just, run of the mill, think about it like a massage. The healing benefits of massage, a lot of people will agree with that, right? Because we're a very sciencey based society at this point, which is not a bad thing, right, in itself. I think we need a more integrated approach, but my point is everyone can generally agree that massage is a therapeutic and enjoyable experience. So think about that when you're thinking about laying your hands on someone. making them well. And so what we would know about a massage therapist, since that seems like it would be an approachable analogy, what we know about a massage therapist is that they can't go into a massage session feeling all gross within themselves. They have to feel whole and feel like they have strength enough to work out whatever's going on with your body. And the massage therapists that I've come in contact with usually are interested in energy work. And that means, like I said before, Reiki, where you're dealing with the ways that people hold stress and even trauma inside of their body and helping them release it. Because you can only do so much with psychoanalysis before, you're going to have to deal with how you've held those things inside of your body and how they create tension. I know that down in my lower back, near the, what metaphysicians would call the root chakra area, I have a lot of tension down there because that has to do with the survival instinct and, worthiness of living and existing and all of that. Those are things that I have to work with all the time. Because of my own trauma issues and stuff that I've mentioned on this show. So, every person is going to be different. They're going to hold trauma in their body in different ways. There happens to be some common zones where women especially hold their trauma, and, you know, it's not hard to figure out why some women would hold that trauma in their breasts or in their uterus or other, reproductive areas or in their back. The back symbolizes the weight that you carry in your day-to-day life and feeling like you're carrying the world, right? Think of the Atlas thing. Like you have back problems, you feel like you have to carry everything with you. And so I'm going to come back to this and I'm going to say, in what way do you reach out and touch others in order to heal them or make their lives better? This is Paperwave with Afternoon Sun on Zivas' 7th moon. So as I mentioned before that interlude, my Ceres is conjunct my midheaven in the 10th house in Sagittarius. It's also conjunct my moon. But it's said that Ceres is in its fall in Sagittarius, and it is exalted or ruled or associated with Virgo. And, Virgo has to do with health and, well-being and people associate Virgo with perfectionism and precision, that kind of thing. And Ceres has more to do with, the harvest and making sure that you've planted things properly so that you can reap what you've sown. But, think about gardening has a lot to do with getting your hands in the dirt. I mean, unless you're an industrial farmer and you've got all these tools and equipment. But either way, you're going to need to, pull up the dirt and get things rolling around, right? So sometimes I just collapse in on myself with these analogies. But anyway, so thinking about the idea of a sign being in its fall and looking at my own chart, I know that Sagittarius, Ceres, this placement for me is not a bad thing. It's actually a good aspect. So what do I mean when I'm speaking in these podcasts about, oh, this is a good placement, oh, this is a bad placement? Although, just like we say, oh, a man, oh, a woman, like it's so hard not to be binary in this culture. So what do I mean when I say good or bad? When I say good, I mean it's easy. It's something that I don't really have to work on as much. It comes naturally to me. Just like somebody who's a natural ice skater, per se, or somebody who's a natural runner, or, whatever they're good at. That placement comes naturally to me. It's not it's not a difficult aspect. So what is a bad or difficult aspect? A difficult aspect is something that you will have to work on in this life. It does not come easily to you. You're going to have to overcome it. And otherwise, you're just going to come up against obstacle and obstacle and obstacle and obstacle. That is what a bad aspect is considered. So let's look at these again and think about it in a different way. So let's look at a good aspect. Now, you remember in the episode where we talked about Jupiter, and we talked about how Jupiter can be a lucky aspect. But if you're a Jupiterian type person, you can annoy people because you always think that everything will just turn out okay, and your optimism can be a pain because there are some people who have to work harder at what you find to be easy. So a good aspect can be something that you can become lazy at and say, well, no, I don't have to work on that. And so I'm just gonna skate through, right? Why am I thinking of skating so much tonight? I don't know. But anyway, so a bad aspect can actually be a stroke of luck because you have to work through it. And just like in Chiron, right, the wounded healer who, because of their wound and because of healing, they become a master at healing that particular wound. A difficult aspect can make you a master at, perfecting this one piece of you that was giving you a lot of problems. So say you always get into conflicts with others and it's not fruitful. Like you don't come out of the situation learning anything, and they don't either because you are just a contrarian, for instance, and it's not a good interaction. So you work on that, and over time, then now you're able to speak to people about better communication practices. So that's just one example of how a difficult aspect can make you a better person, a more well-rounded person, somebody who can approach a situation that somebody else goes through and help them through it. So I want to mention something that I don't usually mention this early in the podcast, which is a healing remedy for activating Ceres. And so this is something that I have constructed based on my chats with a local massage therapist and Reiki healer, and she actually specializes in oils too. And I was lucky enough to meet her kind of by chance, and I had a massage session with her. And we were talking about the different oils, and it's funny, you pay somebody for one type of labor and then they end up just giving you more, right? So here I paid for a massage, but she's educating me on oils, right? And so it was really nice. People always do, more, a lot of people, but, here was an instance where we were having one interaction and then it built on another one. And that was very Aquarius robotic of me. But anyway, so we're talking about oils, and I was talking about how strong rose oil is, and she said, yes, rose oil is known as the queen of oils. And rose oil, if you've ever put rose oil on, I don't know if you've ever smelled it before, but it is just this thick concentration of, obviously, roses. And it's so strong. When you put it on, it's just like, whew, it wakes you right up. It wakes up, it just feels like it shakes your spirit awake or something, So I would say, as a healing oil, especially, if you're feeling down in your sinuses or something, rose is said to be the queen of oils because it helps so many different ailments you could have. Some people, they'll drink rose hip tea and stuff like that. I would just recommend, generally, if you need healing in the area where you have difficult aspects and you want to learn how to work through those difficult aspects, and you believe in overall healing, through doing stuff where your sensory perception can, rose oil, putting it on your body is something that is it's not going to be psychoanalytic, right? You're not going to be sitting down talking with but it might stir something up in you because you're using your other senses. You're also setting an intention of healing. Same with, like I was mentioning, this massage therapist. You get a massage, and the massage, it gets to different triggers within your body. And so we all have different places where we hold on to trauma. For me, mine is down near my tailbone, which would be your root chakra, and where you feel like you struggle for survival. And that's something that I deal with. But there are other places in the body where other people hold their trauma. So I would say, dealing with difficult aspects, don't feel like you can't work through those things. You can work through them, and not only that, when you work through them, the idea is that you then help other people. This is Slaveya Women's Vocal Ensemble with Alilo, Georgian.
Oh,
So we return to the question of how you nurture people, and I want to share a story with you in lieu of a long explanation. And the story is about my grandfather, Harry. He was my last living grandparent, and he passed away in July. And I want to share some other information about that a little later on, but first I'll say that I lived with him for 6 years when my grandmother passed away, and my grandmother was very close with me. We used to have kitchen table talks, and we learned a lot together. She was a Sagittarius, so, that explains a lot if you're already into astrology and you've listened to these podcasts, because you know that I'm an Aquarius with a Sagittarius moon and a stellium in Sagittarius, and she really nurtured my desire to learn about philosophy, and through arguing back and forth sometimes for hours. I say arguing loosely, right? We would debate issues, mostly in religion, honestly, religion and how religion related to secular life, and we used to talk about those types of things for hours, and the afterlife, and I always relate the story. I would ask her, one time in particular I can picture in my mind, I asked her, when you die, and you're a ghost, will you let me know that you're okay? And I do believe that I can feel the presence of spirits, or whatever, guides, angels, whatever your belief system is. But I do feel presences and energies and stuff. But for her, for me to ask, when you're a ghost, will you let me know you're okay? It was blasphemy, right? Because she was a Christian, and she's like, I don't believe in that kind of stuff. And I was like, okay, great. But when you die, can you let me know that you're okay? And she's like, well, I don't believe that. I believe that we're going to go to heaven, and we're not going to have any more contact with this earthly realm. I don't believe that it works like that. And I was like, okay, super. But when you die, can you just let me know that you're okay? And she was like, all right, okay, fine. Because she wasn't gonna get me to stop talking about it. So she just was like, well, sure, fine, I'll let you know. And I believe that she has let me know many times that she's around. Usually it's through a hymn that I haven't heard in forever or ever, and it'll pop into my head and I'll think of her. Or sometimes I feel as though she communicates with me through music. I'll be upset about something and a song will pop on my Pandora, and it seems like it's just talking about exactly what I'm thinking about in my head. And I wonder, is that her? Because, if you ever go into a cemetery and you're listening to music, you're dealing with electronics. Sometimes the frequencies in cemeteries can mess with your electronics. If you're listening to this at night, I didn't mean to spook you out, but to me, it's not really spooky. I believe that there are different energies on this plane, and they're not just physical energies, but that is getting too abstract for some folks, I understand. Just sharing what one person thinks. So back to the original idea about, how do we nurture others? So, while my grandfather was still alive, we used to talk a lot, because I lived with him for 6 years after my grandmother died. Because right before she died, she said, will you help take care of him, because he doesn't have anybody, right? They didn't have many friends because they had left numerous churches because they didn't agree with the different philosophies that the different pastors would have. Usually they would worship at home. They would listen to old sermons from the 70s on cassette tape, or just read the Bible and have Bible study. So they didn't interact with a lot of people. getting up into their 70s. They had been married since my gram was 19 and my pap was 22. So, they had been together forever. They'd been friends forever. And they didn't have many friends that they still kept in touch with, just family. And towards the end of her life, my gram was not really close with her daughter. So, yeah, they weren't really close to anybody. So she just said, will you take care of Pap? And I said, yeah. So I did end up moving in with him because he had a converted basement that was like, wood paneling, kind of like the makeshift stuff they would put up in the 70s in the basement. And so I stayed there with him for a long time, and we were, there for each other. And we did end up getting in a lot of discussions about my dad, who, my dad is a whole other story, but he wasn't in my life, and that's my grandfather's son. And I did have a good relationship with my grandfather for the most part. So it was just kind of, it was almost like he was my makeshift, I shouldn't say makeshift, I should say, my stand-in parent. And I believe, we're raised by a lot of people in the community and in our families, and it just really depends on our personality makeup, who we interact with more. And I was also, raised by some other people, and other grandparents, but, he was my last grandparent. And so yeah, we spent a lot of time together. We used to go grocery shopping together a lot when we lived together. And so looking back at that and thinking about Ceres placements, thinking about how we reach out and nurture others, my grandfather really used his experiences of not being accepted by his own father, who was an alcoholic and who was abusive, and he tried to be at least a good father figure for me. And, whatever happened between him and my dad and my aunt to make them the way that they are, I won't know that story completely. But he really tried with me. He tried to always make sure that I had what I needed when I lived there. We would try to go grocery shopping together, and he used to ask me about the things that I was doing, even though he didn't totally understand them or agree with them or believe that women should be as educated as I became. And so, that was a real point of our disagreement. So, unfortunately, the year before he died, we got into a big disagreement about that because I was about to go and study for a PhD, and here was this person, who would always praise the accomplishments of my cousins who were in business, right? Because that's all that matters in this society. Like, people wonder, how did you become such an anti, everything that you are? And, one of the reasons is because I dealt with a parent figure and, a bunch of other figures in my life. But this one bothered me, as a figure in my life who denied my accomplishments based on the money that my cousins would make. And so, we know that this society values certain signifiers, right? And money and maleness happen to be two that are really big. So, that is definitely a place where we butted heads. But what I want to mention is that he really tried his best with who he was and the generation that he was, and he did try to grow being around me for so long, and getting close. Before my gram died, he and I weren't really close because, he was a veteran. He hadn't had a drink in, I would say, like 30 or 40 years. There's some secrets surrounding that, but, that would make him an alcoholic, right? Because that's kind of the terminology you use, right? You don't ever become not an alcoholic. You're just not a drinking alcoholic. So, his mood was kind of represented by that. It's like, you know, he was definitely he tried to use the tradition of his religion to keep him in line and he wanted to be a good person, I think is what I took away from his life. And I think in many ways he was a good person. You know, I remember hearing stories about his workplace where he was a foreman and a welder, you know, and I remember hearing stories about what he did at the shop and how he stood up for what he thought was right all the time and made the shop a better environment, and people remember him for that. And he also, you know, one time we were in this huge discussion, and it became kind of emotional because, you know, we're talking about my dad, and that's kind of the thing with our family was, you know, what happened to him. And we kind of don't, like, we have our ideas, you know, everyone has their own idea about why someone is the way that they are, and that's all kind of, you know, that's all kind of relative. And in astrology, you find out through their charts that they have their unique purpose, and how they choose to live it out is how they choose to live it out. And so this discussion we were having, it became very emotional, and he said, you know, here's the thing that you can remember about your dad that I thought when I was dealing with my own dad. And his dad was an alcoholic and he was abusive. And he said, I looked at my dad and I said, I'm never going to be like him. And you can look at your father's life and say, you know, these are all the ways that he has hurt me, or things have gone badly for him, you know, whatever that means, or things have been challenging and he didn't meet the challenge, or he's hurt people, right? So we can focus on a concrete thing there. He's hurt people. I will not do that because I've seen what he's done. And so that is what my grandfather tried to impart to me. And I think that was his way of, you know, the laying of the hands, right? The Reiki, the energy work was, look, I know that things have not been easy for you. I know that things have happened to you, but you can be in control of your own life. And I think he did help me do that. And so I was relating the story earlier today. It was a pretty remarkable thing. When my grandfather died, it was under these circumstances that, you know, it made me deal with my own trauma surrounding the family life and things that had happened to me when I was a child. And so one of the reasons was because, you know, I never felt very supported by my father's side of the family, because I was kind of like, you know, the bastard kid, you know, like that's how it was always set up. And so when my grandfather died and nobody called me for a week, and they called me on the day of the funeral, I was really angry. I was upset, and I thought to myself, you know, first of all, I think my grandfather was probably hurt because we haven't talked, because we had this disagreement about him always praising my cousins and then looking on my achievements as if there were some evil thing, you know, and it kind of made me question my own self-concept. But I also had to learn and heal from that. And because I've learned and healed from that, if somebody approaches me with the same situation, I would be able to impart something to them that would help them work through it. Just like he was able to say to me, you can be your own person. You don't need to be like your father. And maybe that's what you can learn from this situation, is just to not be like him. And so when he died, obviously I loved him very much. And so I was very upset, especially with the way that everything went down. And so I got in touch with a psychic that I listen to regularly. She's really great. Her name's Carlene Love. And Carlene and I were talking, and I said, the first thing I need to talk with you about is what happened with my grandfather. And so she started pulling some angel cards and channeling and everything that she normally does. And she said, well, your grandfather is not coming through yet. Your grandfather is not coming through, but your grandmother is coming through. And your grandmother is trying to explain to you that at the time when they were dealing with your father, they were doing things that they thought were like good ways to parent. And they didn't understand what happened at that time. And the thing you have to understand about your grandfather is that he was working against, like, to accept you, he was working against a lot of his conditioning and traditions. And this is without telling Carlene anything about my grandfather. And she knew about his alcoholism, and she said, when your father was growing up, your grandfather was just a totally different person that you don't know. You will never know that part of your grandfather. And he was different to you. And I feel like that's something that he's probably would be proud of, that he did become different. And so Carlene then was saying, your grandfather didn't believe in anything while he was here. And I was like, what are you, it was kind of like a fake outrage, because I was like, what do you mean? He's this evangelical Christian. But in my heart, I was like, you're right. He always seemed like he was going through the motions, like he could be some kind of low-key nihilist that doesn't believe in anything. And so with that, I just kind of kept listening. I was like, yeah, she's right. And then she said, well, he needs to communicate with the spirit world before he can come through for you. And she knew that I was intuitive and I could feel the presence of beings. And she knew that I wouldn't be in touch with him until he was taught lessons in the spirit world and how things, really were. And now, whether that means he forgot who he was indefinitely, or he's a new soul, or whatever, the way I understood it was just that he had been through so much trauma here that he forgot. He forgot who he was. And he forgot what the spirit world is. And he forgot, some things about his mission. But that doesn't mean he didn't totally fulfill it. I don't know what his mission was. I can't speak for him. But tonight I was in a class for my PhD studies, and we were talking about a film called Stories We Tell by Sarah Polley. And in the film, she uses a fractured narrative. She uses some found footage, some reenactments, and present day reflections on this event that happened in her family, which was her mother had an affair, and she ended up having a baby that wasn't by her then husband. So her daughter, who was a product of that affair, grew up thinking that she had a different father than who her biological father really was. And so the biological father's name was Harry, and she finds out about him in her 20s. But people always kind of knew almost. It's just like, maybe she is, maybe she isn't. But then when there was access to a DNA test, she found out the truth. And so anyway, with this fractured narrative and stuff, the idea is that we can't really arrive at other people's truths, but everyone has their own. And everyone has the ability to love and change. And in the scheme of things, when, I saw this infographic the other day, And it's just a picture of what you would see if you were laying in your own gravesite looking up, and the caption read, "This is when everyone will love you." And it's so true, because we come here, we have a mission, but we're gonna come up upon conflicts, and everyone's not gonna love us all the time, but we still do have a purpose here, and we can't forget that. And so during the activity phase, we have a little activity time that we do in the class where we, do some group work and hands-on stuff. And so the activity was, because the narrative's so fractured, we see bits and pieces from everybody's story in the narrative. But what if we just broke off and did a first-person narrative for just one of the characters? And so I thought to myself, I'm looking at the name of the biological dad in the film, and it didn't strike me so much when I was watching the film, but his name is Harry. And I thought, oh, that'd be funny if I was in a group and I was assigned Harry. And sure enough, our group was assigned Harry. And not only were we assigned Harry, but my teacher decided to walk around with note cards just as a reminder of who we had. And she would put the note cards next to the group, on their desk. And so she took the note card that said Harry, and there were 3 people in the group. She could have stuck it in front of either person beside me, but she stuck the Harry note card right in front of my face. Not in a rude way, but just plop, right in the front of my desk. So my desk said Harry. And I'm looking and I'm remembering, I'm thinking of my grandfather, and I'm like, this is him coming through. This has to be him coming through and saying that he's learned the lesson, and actually sharing with me the lesson through this film, or talking about different truths. And I mean, for him, while he was alive, there was one truth. There was one truth, and it could make him depressed, and it could do all kinds of things for him, but it kept him in a routine. It kept him, sane. And it helped him deal with life. So that was the truth that he was going to follow. But I think with this message, I just feel as though he was saying, I understand. I understand you and what you're doing. And, because he didn't understand the PhD program. He didn't understand why I wanted to get so much education. He didn't understand any of it. We used to argue about it. Why don't you do this, or this? Well, first of all, one, there's other barriers to getting into these fields. I won't get into that, but it stirred up a whole thing for me, because there are social factors that he almost helped create with his attitude, but then wouldn't admit existed, which I feel like is a problem for society in general. And so to get that message, I just felt like, it just all came full circle. So the reason I bring this up with Ceres is my grandfather. He had a lot of challenges, but he did try to have a spiritual life in order to better himself, and judging by the accounts of others, just like, in the book, or the film, Stories We Tell, all we see are the accounts of others that talk about the deceased Diane and what kind of life she lived, and they talk about the way that they loved her. But while she was alive, they would have had all these problems with her, like, oh, well, she cheated on her husband. Well, she left her family, or she did this, or she did that. While people are alive, we have a hard time loving them the way that they are, because we're all working through our missions here. But we do still have access to that love. I can't tell you how many people I've lost in my life, and then I've felt like, this sentimental feeling like, but I really loved them. I woke up this morning, for instance, I just felt like, I feel really thankful for a lot of the challenges that I've had, and a lot of the love that I've felt from people through the challenges, even the arguing and stuff. I mean, even all of that, I'm not counting anything out of the equation. I'm thankful for all of it. This is Unheard Music Concepts with Disconnected. So earlier in the podcast, I was talking about the mythology. And so the mythology gets pretty smashed up, but it is really the story of mother and daughter. And if you think about, the bond, so the tale is that once Proserpina goes down into hell, her mother is sad, and so it becomes winter. And so when we think about the bonds that we form with loved ones, we think about how it hurts us when they're hurting. And we think about things like empathy. And not just empathy, but, people would say solidarity, or nowadays the youngsters would say, the people coming up would say that you have to be an accomplice with somebody that you love, right, in order to help them. So the problem with Ceres was that she was so troubled because there was nothing she could do. And so the idea of the Ceres archetype is that you feel powerless for so long, but then you develop these powers to learn what you can do to overcome that powerlessness. And then in turn, you help other people. So I would say, if we had a reboot of this story, for instance, in say Marvel makes a reboot of this story, they would have maybe this happening to the daughter where she's lured into this trap. But then for the mother would be, the superhero, if we want to look at it from the vigilante mythos type thing. The mother turns into this superhero, and then she goes down to hell, and she grabs her daughter out, and she comes up with some kind of method where she is able to save the day, right? If we look at it from that. If we look at it from a more postmodern standpoint, maybe the daughter needed that time where she was going through that. I mean, that's just a really tough sell for me, but postmodern story would say, well, what's the truth of Hades, or like what's the truth of her going down and taking the pomegranate? Maybe she wanted to eat the pomegranate. I mean, we would just really get into kind of shaky territory there where there's no good and evil. So this is why archetypes, I don't think, are totally useless. Once we got into, especially in the field of literature, once we got into the idea of like critical theories and all of these things, we lost our connection to the idea that something could be like toxic or harmful. We kind of eliminated that idea. That's why I think some people are kind of going back and leaning on this idea of modernism, where there's still like this way to access evil, or I'm sorry, that came out funny, but a way to access what is good and what is evil, or what hurts people and what is good for us and how we can help each other. So, it's hard to navigate that in everyday life sometimes. It definitely is. This is Lolique with Parvane. So, listeners, hopefully listening to what I told you about my own family can help you work through some of your own family murkiness and see your family in a different light. See what your family was meant to teach you. You know, Ceres has to do with hard work. You know, think about mothering. Mothering is hard stuff. So is fathering. You know, and in our culture, we sometimes don't talk about fathering as much, but parenting is hard. Being there for somebody is hard, especially, you know, if they're fighting you or if they're trying to get at your weaknesses or, you know, down you to show someone love. It's tough. Why do you think there was a proverb created, you know, love your neighbor as yourself, turn the other cheek? I mean, it's because humans act a certain way where that would be a necessary proverb. How do you feel abandoned or unworthy too? That's the flip side. You know, how were you not nurtured that can help you learn something about the world and then help others?